Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
I'm Pastor Nikira Wolf, and my pronouns are they, them.
In this episode, we'll discuss the fourth Sunday in Lent, which this year falls on March 27th. One content notification for this episode, we talk about colonization and racism when discussing our deep dive.
Check out the episode descriptions for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
For our deep dive into creation and colonization today, we are excited to have with us Pastor Nikira Wolf Hernandez, who is a queer activist, teacher, and preacher. They currently pastor Brighton Alston Congregational United Church of Christ in Boston. They are mixed Paiute, Latinx, Japanese, and white, and live into both their Christian faith and indigenous spiritual practice. Nikira facilitates workshops for the Trans Spiritual Care Initiative and Toward Right Relationship with Indigenous Peoples. They love jumping into cold water and hiking with their dog, Jessie. Welcome.
Welcome. We're so glad to have you with us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, Nikira, you have done a lot of work around creation care and relationship with creation. I'm curious how you experience and engage with creation in your life and work today.
Well, I just had a bite of pecan pie, and so I'm engaging with the creation in the vanilla that flavored the custard and the pecans that are toasted on top of the pie, the wheat that made the crust. That was just in the last 5 minutes. So I would say that, creation is a part of everything that we do and are every day. There isn't a separation between us and the divine presence of God embodied in the world around us.
Yeah, that is a beautiful reminder of that connection. I think it's easy as we gather virtually in 3 different states to feel a disconnect with creation, but that is not reality. I just had coffee, and the coffee beans and the creamer and the little caramel bits that I magically found to put on my coffee are also all part of creation.
Yeah, and I am blessed to live in a place where the water that comes out of my tap is safe to drink, although I think slightly more flavored with gravel than strictly necessary. But all of that is creation as well.
Yeah.
As the pandemic started, I listened to the audiobook version of the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, which I definitely recommend the audiobook version because hearing her tell all those stories was fantastic. And among the many things that she talked about, she contrasted indigenous and colonial ecological practices. And I was especially struck by how the indigenous approach that she described to creation sounds a lot like the I-thou relationship of equals and respect that we were talking about a couple of weeks ago with another guest, Chaplain Russell, rather than an I-it relationship of dominion, ownership, transactional relationships, that kind of thing. Treating creation as a person, as a beloved, as an equal, according to the terms that Martin Buber used. I was wondering, how does this approach to our relationship with creation change how we treat creation, change how we think about creation?
That's such a great question. And I want to say that I love Braiding Sweetgrass. That is probably my favorite book that I have read this past decade.
Wow.
Her way with language and the way she weaves both scientific Western ways of knowing with traditional indigenous ways of knowing.
Yeah.
So exquisite. One of the things that she talks about is the way that we pronoun the beings that we encounter in our lives, including, of course, our more than human kin in creation. And I was talking with a group the other day about this. They asked me to come to their church and talk about what Native spirituality means in a Christian context. And I was talking about something that happened at our church this winter, which is that one of the maple trees dropped a huge branch into our parking lot. And it prompted a discussion about whether we take that maple tree out in its entirety to avoid that kind of thing in the future. And our building and grounds committee was talking about that maple tree as an it.
Sure.
And I wondered how it would have been different if we had talked about the maple tree as her, or as them. If we'd said, are we going to cut down our sibling, the maple tree?
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to take her out, after having lost one of her arms?
Sure.
It may have been that we still would have made the decision to remove the maple tree because, in fact, it turns out that that tree was probably going to fall over on the parking lot eventually.
Oh dear.
But I think the conversation would have been very different. In the way, it's a different conversation when we use a he pronoun for God, right?
Yeah.
Than when we use a gender neutral pronoun for God. Our language shapes the way that we view the world. And when we find our ways into language that honors creation as our siblings, as related, that's different. And I would say, I was going to say we honor the rest of creation as our equals, but actually, in most indigenous teachings, we come last. Us two-leggeds, us humans,
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
we are the youngest sibling in creation, and we know the least about living together in community on this earth.
Yeah, I have heard you say that before and talk about like that particular relationship, and I love the way you talk about the more than human creation, because I think that gets at that, right? That's part of the language that reinforces that we are the youngest in the family. We are the newest to this place we call home. And as you were talking about the maple tree, I was thinking about it as not just about the situation, not just as like her, the maple tree, but also when you're talking about cutting down a maple tree, especially a tree that is old, you're talking about an entire family of like a small community of creation, because old and dead trees are home to owls and animals and all sorts of different creatures. It has been a growing thing for me and a newer thing to learn about like that particular ecosystem of trees that are towards the end of their life and how they interact with other members of creation. And then like what responsibility do we have as humans who want to protect things like cars and where that value lies. Yeah.
Well, and I think it especially hits a little harder now this morning. We're recording this episode a few weeks in advance, and last night was the night of the first concentrated attack on the nuclear power plant in Ukraine by the Russian army. And that was terrifying. I mean, it was terrifying for me halfway around the world. I can't imagine what it was like there. But if there had been a respect for what that could have done in the moment, then it would have been a lot less terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
And if that had included a respect for creation or a understanding of how that interacts with everything else going on at the time, it would have been a very different experience.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up because I think that the lens that we use to view creation is helpful sometimes as an entry point for how we view our human siblings as well.
Mm.
Because, what is happening in the Ukraine right now is absolutely heartbreaking, and events with far more significant loss of life and displacement have been happening for decades that haven't received the same kind of attention because of what those bodies look like, right? Because of folks who are white-skinned, European. And so when I think about, extending that I-thou relationship to our more than human kin, I also think it's important that we don't bypass extending the I-thou relationship to all of our human kin as well, which gets at some of the conversation about like environmental racism, right? The way that our relationship to creation is not separate from us as a human species, but it may come back and have effects that hit folks from the global majority, folks who are low income, women and trans folks, much harder than it hits folks with more privilege.
Sure.
Yep. I mean, I remember learning in college, I think, about how many dumps, how many like waste areas for like waste deposit were in the Bronx in New York compared to Long Island or Manhattan, right? And like who has the money to move away from the areas where we are literally dumping our waste and who doesn't? Or the ozone depletion, right? the hole in the ozone layer was caused by countries like the United States. And because of the like rotational things, impacted folks mostly in the African continent. And so the greater harm, even, it's not just that like who can move away and who can avoid and who has the resources, but also like who is causing that, whose space rocket jet causes the pollution that causes the asthma and the breathing problems for people around the world, in the global majority, as you said. So that also raises that aspect of thinking about creation care, raises also the questions of like how do we care for a creation and that is in the midst of catastrophic climate change. And one of the most positively impactful changes that we could make, and this is based on both like indigenous knowledge that has said this and science that backs it up, is to return land and control of land. Control seems like the wrong word, but like stewardship of land, responsibility, resources, those sorts of things to Native peoples to care for. And there's a movement called the Land Back movement that specifically focuses on giving land back and is, I think, largely focused in what is known as the United States and Canada. And I'm curious if you can tell us more about why the movement to give land back, as well as the many movements that are occurring throughout the earth to protect land from pipelines, like this movement at Standing Rock and Line 3 more recently, are so important.
When I think about what it means to me as an Indigenous person to show up at Standing Rock or to support the folks going to Line 3, it's more than just a particular pipeline or one of the folks who I've had the honor of organizing with, Karina Gold, in Ohlone Territory in California, is working to protect the shell mounds from development, right? And it's not just that particular shell mound. It is a way of shifting how we relate to land and quote unquote resources from one of extraction to one of responsibility. And the ancestors of mine who came over from Europe did a horrible job of that.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the ancestors of mine who are indigenous to this place, to Turtle Island, specifically for me, I'm Paiute, so that's Eastern California, Western Nevada, have a different kind of relationship with the land that they have been on since the beginning. And this is reflected, I think, in how we conceive of spirituality. Most white settlers coming to this country came in with Christianity, which is a religion of a text rather than a religion of a place.
Sure.
So indigenous spirituality is rooted in going to that particular bend in the river to pray and knowing that body of water, that particular body of water, as the embodiment of spirit, while also recognizing that further downstream 100 miles, someone else has another bend of river that is a particular embodiment of God.
Sure.
And when you have embodiment of God in a place, in the land themselves, it changes relationship. Whereas if God is portable and can go with you from place to place, but isn't necessarily in relationship with the trees, with the soil, with the air of that place, it's much easier to have an extractive relationship. So I think when, in terms of spiritual connection, giving land back into Native stewardship, which is much more about responsibility than it is about privilege, is a way of changing our relationship to the land by knowing deeply in our bones that the land is spirit and the land nourishes the spirit within us. And so we take care of them.
Yeah.
That got a little rambly, and I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No,
That was right on point.
Yeah, as you were talking, like I can see it made a lot of sense to me, and I've never thought about Christianity that way as like a religion or a spirituality of a text, but it makes a lot of sense to me. And as someone who has lived in multiple different places throughout my life, particularly my adulthood, I also have a connection, a deep connection to the place where I was born and where I spent the first 18 years of my life in the mountains of Colorado, what is now known as Colorado. And I don't have a particular religion or spirituality about that's rooted in that place, but I do have experience rooted in that place. And there is a different, I just have, like, it resonated with me in that I do feel like I have a different relationship with those particular mountains than I do with mountains further west and mountains further east, with the plains that I lived on for several years, but that there are ways that earth and creation nurture us and hold us. And I don't know, I got the image of a womb, that like we think about it as just having like one parent with a womb that gives birth to us, and that is accurate, but also like there is also a whole creation that also gives birth to us in our lives. And as we like to think about like growing up and the first 18 years of my life as a different kind of gestational period, a different kind of growing and nurturing period. I don't know.
Well, and I was also thinking of how having a somewhat mobile life changes your relationship to creation too, because I grew up in the same general part of a state for my first 18 years, but I moved around a bit during those years and between different towns. And at various times, for various reasons, I have like emotionally rejected parts of those places. Whether or not that was, for good reason or not can be argued later. But I realized recently, my parents have divorced and retired two different places. And so right now, I literally don't have any members of my family that are living where they lived when I was little.
Mm.
I don't have any ties to my childhood homes or to places that I have lived for lengthy periods of time, because my parents now live, because they moved at the start of the pandemic. I haven't actually been to their new places yet. And they're across the country from each other, and we're all spaced rather far apart. And so it's so much harder to have that connection to creation when you're constantly moving through creation, whether or not you're actually under control of how often you're moving through creation, because I have not been in control of most of my moves during my life.
Mm.
I can see how that impacts it too.
Yeah. I mean, both of our experiences, Kay's and my experiences, right, are not from family that has generations. It's not from cultures that are rooted in place in spirituality, the way that you were talking about, Nikira. And yet there's still a connection, right? Like it talking about indigenous spirituality and that spirituality of place and the connection to the river bend or the trees or whichever piece it might be, right? The rock formations is something that is particular to tribes and cultures, and the like larger concept of connection to creation when we actually like pause. And I really appreciate that as we're having this conversation, there's a lot more space for like taking a deep breath before answering, that there is more spaciousness in terms of time to also like reflect more intentionally and to be curious and explorative about connections to physical space as well. Yeah, a beautiful thing, a beautiful gift.
When we consider humans being the youngest parts of creation and the newest members of creation's family, I was sort of trying to think of, and what age exactly would we be? And I think at this point we've reached the rebellious teenager stage. But
feels like how we're acting. Yeah.
that also might depend on exactly which culture you're discussing at the time. So, yeah.
Funny, I was thinking we were in the terrible twos.
I was like,
Yeah, I
either
see that one too.
toddler or teenager.
Yeah.
No, like definitely not
Yeah,
in between those, but yeah.
I don't even like, we don't even have to get to the adult stage right away. Like, if we could just go to preteen, like preteens are remarkably functional as an age group, and that might be a great idea. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned age group because, I think that when we talk about creation, one of the things that we can't avoid talking about is the climate crisis that we are in. And it is not the adults who are leading the way.
Mm-hmm.
It's our youth.
Yeah.
The fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline was started by Indigenous youth who ran their petition to the Army Corps of Engineers. Ran, I don't even remember how many hundreds of miles. And it is the youth who you need to listen to. And there's a concept that spans a lot of different Native cultures, thinking of 7 generations into the future. With every action that I take, I need to think about how will that impact 7 generations from now. And so when we think about time, I think that's another difference between folks indigenous to Turtle Island and the white settlers who come to this place is time scale in terms of thinking about how our actions reverberate.
Sure.
And when we think about putting land back into Indigenous care, Indigenous stewardship, Indigenous relationship, I think that is one of the key pieces that Indigenous folks bring is how do we imagine caring for this land so that it is even more beautiful, even more abundant and flourishing community for 7 generations from now.
Mm.
Yeah. Personally speaking, I work with a largely very white community in a rural area. And while I don't have personal family ties in this area, a lot of the folks I work with, their families have lived here 3, 4 generations at least, which is about as far as their memory back goes. And I don't get the sense that they can imagine 7 generations out in either direction, but they can imagine 2 or 3 generations out. And I've heard them do that as they discuss their grandchildren and their great grandchildren. But taking that next step and imagining, but what about after that? It seems to be the real sticking point.
Yeah. And I think as like in the politics realm of it, the people making the decisions in politics are not the
Elderly?
youth.
They're not the youth, and they're thinking on a 4-year cycle, not on a,
Yeah.
140-year cycle.
Yeah. Some on a 2-year cycle.
Yeah.
It's such a shortened timeline that there is no incentive to care for what will happen even a decade from now in order to preserve the power now and in the next election. And there's plenty of incentive collectively as a community, as humanity, right? There is incentive because we want our children and our children's children and our children's children's children and to those 7th generations to have land that can nourish them and can cradle them and hold them.
I'm going to pause you for just a sec because you said to have land.
Yeah.
And as we're talking about language and how language shapes our discourse, our imagining of the world around us, how might you rephrase that?
To be with land, to be able to experience land and be in relationship with land. Yeah. Thank you for that. That was, we want the future generations that are only glimmers or not even glimmers yet in people's imagination to be in relationship with a more than human creation that is healthy, that is not struggling to survive against the pollution that we continue to create through wars or travel or any number of methods. Yeah. And yet we restrict voting and we restrict participation.
I have some thoughts about how we could, make sure that politicians understand that there are long-term consequences for those things. But to be entirely honest, they're probably not all that charitable, so we can just skip those.
I was going to say, are this appropriate for this podcast?
Well, it was all, new legal options, like, have each year's high school graduating class decide the pension for that year for all previous politicians of that area. And that kind of thing. But I can see how that could, go badly. So maybe not actually a great idea, but still, thoughts.
Yeah.
What if we made each of the nations, and by nation I mean the Maple Nation, the Frog Nation, the Salmon Nation, voting members of this country?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Water Nation.
Water Nation would, they all have a lot to say. But thinking about water here in where I live, which is known as Baltimore, and Flint, Michigan, and
reminds me of a time that one of my elders really schooled me on the sacredness of water. I was preparing to take leadership in an Indigenous ceremony, and I was visiting my elders, my aunties, Karen and Sarah, and in Indigenous culture, elders hold a lot more respect than they do in mainstream US culture right now.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways to show that is to do things for your elders, right? Like your elders shouldn't be washing the dishes when there are young folks around who can do that.
Mm-hmm.
Dishes happen to be a chore that I deeply loathed.
Amen. Right there with you.
As my former housemate Emily knows this.
Mm-hmm.
Dishwashers are a sign that God loves us and wants us to be happy.
Oh, right? Amen. I was so happy when I got a portable dishwasher into my current house. But I was at my elder Karen and Sarah's house, and they live in a place where water is really scarce. And so there's not a dishwasher because there's not an abundance of water with which to run one.
Mm-hmm.
All the dishes are done by hand, soaking the dishes in a sink and then rinsing with as little water as possible. And so I'm doing the dishes because I know that I'm supposed to. It's a good thing to do, but I'm sure I'm grumbling under my breath. And my elder Karen hears me, and she says to me, "Little Wolf, how can you imagine that you might be ready to step into leadership in this ceremony when you aren't able to see the dishes as ceremony?
Mm.
You have water flowing over your hands. You have clean water with which to wash the dishes. This water is blessing you. This water is giving you their gift to do this work in front of you. And you have food that you are actually washing off of the plates, meaning you have enough abundance that those plates aren't already absolutely spotless out of hunger, out of need. And you're washing more than your own plate, which means that you've just shared a meal with people. You have community around you. And so washing the dishes, letting the water bless you, is just as much ceremony as being out on that dance ground. And when I think about what the water has to say, that's the story that comes to mind for me.
That's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
I think about the ways like that for me sparks the ways that I tell people, give like the different things that I tell people when it comes to remembering our baptism as Christians, right? That every time water washes over our hands or washes over us in a shower, that there is space to remember and appreciate God's love in that.
Yeah.
But I think especially in this season of Lent that we are in the midst of, where there's been, it seemed like at the beginning of Lent at least, which is technically where we still are, there is a bigger push than usual, I think, around you don't have to give something up for Lent. And like there's always a little bit of conversation about taking something on, a new practice or something like that. But I wonder about this, what you are saying, Nikira, of what does it look like to be more present in the smaller moments, the more daily moments, the less unique moments of our lives, and to reflect on that, as you started out telling us about the pecan pie and the connection to creation in the pecan pie. What does it look like? I think for those of us who are not Native, it's not going to be that washing dishes is ceremony, but what does it look like for washing dishes to be experienced as love and care for and from creation, community, relationship?
And I think, given that we are so fond of abolishing false binaries in this show and discussing the more complicated aspects of life, I think we can also admit that appreciating something and enjoying it are actually two separate things. Like Nikira, it does not sound like you enjoy washing dishes still to this day. Being able to appreciate something and actively enjoying it are two separate things, and that's okay. Like, I can appreciate all of those gifts that you shared, and I can see how that can make for a better way of life, and also still really dislike doing the dishes. That all of those things can be true at the same time.
But you know what's really interesting about that, Kay, is that when I step out of the more settler colonialist model of time that says that my output today is more important than my well-being tomorrow, when I leave that place and give myself time to settle in and to remember and to treat washing the dishes as prayer, then it's not something I dislike at all.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And how often do I do that? Not very.
Okay, good. I feel better now. Yeah, it's a lovely thought, and I can see how you get there, but that doesn't mean I'm on that road myself. So But speaking of who gets to tell which stories, we have been in a lengthy, and I would say definitely international conversation over the last, I don't even know how long, how many years, about reconciliation and history and who tells which stories and who should be telling which stories and all of that. And I was wondering what concepts or priorities guide you in those conversations.
Well, if you want to hire me to consult on that over the next 7 years, we might get to answering that question.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably fair.
But let's see if there's a short version. Well, first of all, in terms of your query about, how long has this conversation been going on? I mean, the conversation about who shapes a narrative began the moment that the first settlers from Europe arrived on the shores of Turtle Island, right?
Mm-hmm.
And whose story gets told. More recently, I think it's really the Indian power movement, which I think was inspired and drew from and mutually supported the Black Power movement. So, looking at the
Mhm.
60s and 70s,
Mm-hmm.
I have the occupation of Alcatraz as part of the American Indian movement.
Yeah.
You have the work done around recognizing the massacre at Wounded Knee, and more recently, No Dapple, protests against Line 3, and then all of the smaller pieces that don't make the national news that are happening all over the place all the time. So I think acknowledging that history began to be told in a certain way as soon as two cultures met is important.
Mm-hmm.
In a Christian context, I think it's really important to lift up the doctrine of discovery and the way
Mm.
that it was religion, Christianity, that really backed the disenfranchisement of Native folks and said basically that it was not only just okay, but our Christian duty to either convert or enslave Indigenous folks, and that the land belonged to white settlers and not to Indigenous folks. Bringing that up in all of the places that we worship, that we pray, that we teach, that we preach is really key. And I think also talking about the way that, the doctrine of discovery then morphs into manifest destiny, this idea that it's white settlers who are destined to own and to control land from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and really taking a look at some of the tactics that are used to get there. You have forced removal, you have genocide, but you also have attempts at cultural genocide, like
Mm-hmm.
the religious boarding schools, like
Yeah.
killing off of the buffalo, the food sources for so many different tribes. I could go on this track for a while, but I guess I would say learning the high points, or rather the low points of history, and then also recognizing that Indigenous people are here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And not only that, but the US Census says that we're growing. I think something like growth of like 20%.
Wow.
I think knowing that most Indigenous folks live in cities, which is not your stereotypical, Native person in a teepee on the plains. I think the efforts to revive language that many tribes are going through right now are really important. We talked earlier about how language shapes how we view and interact with the world around us, with creation. And I love that so many tribes are now making a concerted effort to hold on to their languages. Yeah. I feel like I'm rambling a little bit again, and I'm not sure that I answered your query.
No, I think all of that definitely plays in. I'm also reminded, and I cannot remember where I saw it, so this is going to bug me for days now, but there was a roundtable discussion between a bunch of different scholars, a couple of graduate students, and some other folks about religious diaspora in the world. And they had conversations about the Sikh community, about Islam, about lesser known religions, Jainism, and so on. And eventually, and this roundtable took place in America, and eventually someone with an indigenous background slapped the table and said, "When are we going to talk about the biggest religious diaspora in the world? When are we going to talk about the Christian diaspora and what that's done to people?" And 9/10 of the room was floored, and the rest of them were all like giving a standing ovation. And it's a wonderful story, and it was a great conversation. But just sometimes when you're inside the story, you can't see the story, you know? Sometimes your point of view really does change how you understand things. Yeah.
Kate, I posted that story to my Facebook page less than a week ago.
Actually, come to think of it, that happened a while ago, though. Like, I did not see the story a week ago, but
That's
yeah,
fantastic.
it might have like come from you originally through Twitter or something. But okay, well, great.
The post did not originate with me. I think, when you're talking about being inside of something, it's difficult to see it. What a lot of tribes are working toward right now is getting Indigenous curriculum taught in schools, particularly when we talk about U.S. history. I know that growing up, that was not featured at all in my U.S. history courses.
No. Yeah.
And yet, it impacts pretty much every time period in the U.S. And so one thing to think about in terms of solidarity with Native folks in your community is to see, what's being taught in elementary school, high school about Indigenous folks. If you've got kids, get yourself on the school board and ask those questions and push for curriculum to include history from a Native perspective.
Yeah. And I think my connection is mostly in education is mostly to English teachers. And then part of it is this push that has been happening to ban certain books. And I know one of my best friends is a librarian for a school district and has had like people pushing to ban certain books. And the first one was The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, which is a novel by Sherman Alexie. And while there are complicated pieces of Sherman Alexie's person and actions in the world, those people weren't even aware of that. And the reason that it was banned was because I think it mentions masturbation is what was said. But the reality is it is a story about a Native kid. And so people were pushing for it to be not part of the curriculum. They ended up deciding that it was okay the recommendation I think was to keep it in the library but not be part of the high school curriculum because of the politics around that particular school district, right? And so it is like history, yes, and also like every subject has so much more space than it has been given credit for to have Native history, Native culture, Native present be part of how we think about things and what we learn. So adding on to the history part, but also and adding in the like literature and the stories that we tell.
Yeah. Can I jump in on the Sherman Alexie banned for masturbation bit?
Yeah.
Just to say, when I think about creation, I think one of the ways that Christianity has failed is to say that our bodies are wrong, our bodies are inherently sinful, and part of the way that Christianity gets there is making sex wrong, right? Which is for many of us who aren't somewhere on the ACE spectrum, like sex is an integral part of how we experience our bodies in the world, whether that's sex with ourselves or sex with other people. And by making that wrong outside a very specific context, Christianity has asked us to divorce ourselves from our bodies, which divorces us from creation, right? Because our bodies are a part of this creation. And this gets complicated in Native communities, right? Because we experienced a lot of Christian missionaries, a lot of teaching. The way that my ancestors were taught English was through a missionary lens. And so the words that we were taught meant one thing in English means something a little bit different in Paiute, right? And so getting back to this way of like the way that we conceive of language, the words that we use shape how we interact with creation, what we label as good and bad, and the ways that we try to differentiate between those two things and say that they are separate separates us from creation.
Yeah, my experience, the longer I live and the more I dive into my own spirituality, the more connected those are and the more clearly connected those are for me. My own.
Could you say more about that, Pastor?
Yeah, my own experience of my body and the joy and the pleasure that my body can create and experience is so very tied into the spirituality of my body and the ways that, and it can be sex, and it can be food, and it can be snuggles, and it can be hugs, and it can be a warm blanket. Like, there's so many different ways that we can experience joy and pleasure. And when we start to take stuff out, I think Elle Dowd, who's been on this podcast before, had a post about comparing purity culture and diet culture, that they're both doing the same thing of trying to control bodies and restrict bodies. And both of those are ways to separate us from creation and to separate us from God. And so, like, having that, like, being more aware about that, then I get to make more intentional decisions about being connected, about making sure I am connected with God, and I am connecting with God in my body and not just in an intellectual sense.
Well, and what a great conversation for Lent, too, right? Mm-hmm. My understanding of Lent is it's a time to reflect on the ruptured relationship that we have between God and ourselves and all of our siblings, human and more than human, in creation, and to turn back toward those relationships and see about repair. And when I think about relationship repair, like, so much of that is about refinding that joy of connection. Mm. And so I'm thinking about Lent and spiritual practice, and the spiritual practice of finding joy in our connection with the world on a daily basis. AKA, your spiritual practice for Lent is to masturbate.
You heard it here first. I am curious, particularly given our Joshua reading for today. There's this difficult combination in Joshua of colonization, in that they have violently taken the land of Canaan for themselves. And also, they're eating their first Passover with food that the land has produced. And that is a celebration of liberation from slavery. And so that is a particular, like, complexity of power and oppression and liberation. And I know you, as a queer Indigenous pastor, also hold within you these intersections of power and oppression. And I'm curious, I know there is not enough time to actually say the fullness of how you navigate that, but if there are particular things that help you navigate those spaces or those relationships, those conversations about those complexities.
My understanding of Scripture is that it is a record of people's experiences with the divine, with God, with Spirit. And it comes through our human filters, and we sometimes get a little mixed up, what's God and what's me. Mm-hmm. And I think it is both possible to have done violence, right, by colonizing, by violently pushing folks out of their homeland, and also to continue to be connected to God in some way. We are not all good or all evil. We are not all connected or all disconnected. And it shows up in odd juxtapositions sometimes, and painful juxtapositions sometimes.
Sure.
And sometimes we can sort out what's God and what's not ourselves, and sometimes we need someone to hold up a mirror. And I think that in our time, we are finally at a point with our discourse around Indigenous sovereignty that we are able to hold up that mirror and say, wait a minute, I see the God in this moment of feasting from the land, of being deeply connected to place. And I also see the harm in the violent colonization. For myself, I hold being a pastor as an Indigenous person with a commitment to wield the institutional privilege of Christianity for movement spaces, in particular for lifting up Indigenous sovereignty, for calling Christians into right relationship with the traditional stewards of land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a powerful way of existing in the world and in the church.
Absolutely. Our first reading for this episode is from Joshua chapter 5, verses 9 through 12. The Israelites, who have wandered in the desert for 40 years, after escaping slavery in Egypt, celebrate Passover, and then end their exile by eating the crops of Canaan. So God's gift of manna to them ends.
So one of our themes from this passage is the idea of nourishment from the land. And we talked about that. Nikira shared a lot about kind of how we think about that. And I love the pecan pie and the coffee beans, and
Sure.
and I will go back to the Wizard. I don't know why I'm on a Wizard of Oz series kick, because I haven't read it in a long time, in like years now.
Maybe you need to watch the movie again. Maybe this is your subconscious trying to tell you something.
Maybe I do.
Or Wicked.
Or Wicked. Well, yeah, but the ways that food kind of magically happens to exist for Dorothy and her companions. And so she is not always in right relationship with the apple trees and the trees that bear fruit, because some of them get mad when she takes fruit from their branches. And with others, it is a relationship of trees producing fruit and Dorothy having need for food, and so it works well. But
Sure.
that land, nourishment, food. Yeah.
Well, and presumably there's a certain symbiotic relationship going on there, because Dorothy will also be later scattering those seeds elsewhere, whether, intentionally or unintentionally, by getting rid of her apple cores.
It is
So,
true. And the whole like carbon dioxide oxygen cycle also.
yeah.
Now I want to, like, next time I'm by like a fruit tree or something, or really any plant that produces something that I could eat, I just want to, like, if I'm like picking basil leaves off my basil plant, and I just like breathe on it a little, be like, thank you, because then I'll be giving it carbon dioxide.
Actually, that sounds a lot like braiding sweetgrass. I think you'd like the book. It's very good.
I think I have the book. I just haven't read it yet.
And then in verse 9, we read, "The Lord said to Joshua, 'Today I have rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt.' And so that place is called Gilgal to this day." Okay, so the Gilgal thing is just that the word Gilgal means to wheel or to roll. So that's why that is noted in the text. But about this whole using the word disgrace here, I've been reading Brene Brown's new book, Atlas of the Heart, lately, very, very slowly, because it's the kind of thing you kind of have to digest in pieces, at least for me. And I think it sparked in me a need to investigate this word disgrace here, because there are so many different ways you could take that. Like, was Egypt a disgrace to the Israelites? Were the Israelites disgraced themselves? Like, there's different ways you
Egyptians
can
did,
understand
like...
it. Yeah, and I looked into the word in the original Hebrew. My Hebrew is terrible, so I'm not going to bother trying to pronounce it for you. You're welcome. But that word is more about having been scorned. It's not that the Israelites, having been enslaved, was something that they should be ashamed of, or that they did something wrong themselves, but that it was a sign of the scorn that Egypt had for them. And so, going along with Brene Brown's concepts, remember that shame is you telling yourself, I am bad. Guilt is telling yourself, I did something bad. And humiliation is someone else made me feel bad. And this particular case, the use of the word disgrace is about humiliation. It's not about shame. It's not about guilt.
That's really helpful. I think there's so much, especially in Christianity, that gets wrapped up in a confusion of guilt, shame, and humiliation. And
yeah,
I really appreciated the conversation that we had with Reverend Callie Swanland, which
that was great.
We can link to. We had that conversation last year, almost a year ago.
It's been a while.
Yeah, it was the second Sunday after Pentecost, I believe. But that awareness is helpful to me, and I sometimes forget it, and so react to things from a place of shame when it should be guilt or humiliation, or vice versa. Yeah. And then in verse 10 we read, "While the Israelites were encamped in Gilgal, they kept the Passover in the evening on the 14th day of the month in the plains of Jericho." And this reminded me of those moments that happen in a lot of different adventure stories, but the one that is most sticking out to me is Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, where there's this adventure that people are on, and then there's a sudden realization, oh, this is this special day, this holiday, this anniversary, this whatever. And the realization that Harry and Hermione have when they are going to Godric's Hollow, that this must be Christmas Eve, and that bittersweet homesickness of knowing that it is a special day and it is not the place that you normally celebrate it. And yeah, which gets into the complexities that Nikira mentioned of Passover in a place and in a land that is already occupied.
Yeah.
And then our second reading for this episode is 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 16 through 21. God has made all things new through Christ and has reconciled the entire world and all of history, an immense act of grace and forgiveness. So one of the themes in this passage is newness in reconciliation. And I still love the movie Encanto, and spoilers towards the end, but when there's cracks that are happening in the house as Abuela holds the family too tightly.
Mhm.
So the cracks happen, and then everything just like earthquake, shatter, crumble. But then there's this space of reconciliation, particularly between Mirabel and Abuela, and out of that reconciliation, the candle that had been kind of the symbol of the magical powers of the family had gone out, and then in the like cracks and stuff, and then in the reconciliation, the candle becomes a whole new candle. The house becomes a new house, and it's in a lot of ways they resemble the old one, but it is actually like not the same. It's not totally different, but it is a new home and a new candle to represent the newness of relationship.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And then diving into the verses, we read, "From now on, therefore, we regard no one from a human point of view. Even though we once knew Christ from a human point of view, we know Christ no longer in that way." And my assumption has always been that this meant we're regarding people from God's point of view, and that could still be true. And also, given our conversation, I am now thinking about, like, what if it is that we regard no one from a human point of view, but instead from a more than human point of view, from the point of view of creation, of the Water Nation
Yeah.
and the Maple Nation. And there's a story that is not true, but I like to tell it anyway, of that elephants actually, the emotions and experience of elephants when they look at humans is like humans when they look at puppies. And it has like since been like apparently
That
like,
is totally a thing that humans would tell themselves. Yes.
yeah, it apparently is not true, but I love that.
Right.
And like no doubt there is utter terror for many elephants when they see humans.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that would be such a more insightful perspective and would be a divine perspective.
Absolutely. I would also say that I'd prefer that perspective idea because I have learned through painful experience that anytime a human tells you that they're looking at something from God's perspective, that is a danger signal and you should run far, far away.
Yes, we can't actually look at things from God's perspective as
Yeah,
much as we might
for
want
good
to.
reason, because we're not God,
Hmm.
which is something I feel like I need to wave a giant flag saying sometimes.
Yeah.
And then in verse 18 we read, "All this is from God, who reconciled us to God through Christ, and has given us the ministry of reconciliation." Which absolutely sounds like an office that the Ministry of Magic could have used in Harry Potter, the Ministry of Reconciliation.
Yes.
Absolutely. To reconcile themselves to the Muggle world and to various species, including the House Elves especially, and various real world governments as well, like the Prime Minister, who they treated rather badly.
Mm-hmm.
I can't even imagine how terrible their foreign relations were. So, that seems like and also there are still some real world governments that could absolutely use a Ministry of Reconciliation or Office of Reconciliation, call it something else.
Mm-hmm.
But that sounds like a great idea. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd be a fan. It seems
Yeah.
like maybe, the author would benefit from that too.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
With the emphasis on the government, on the ministry or the government that has the office being reconciled to others rather than others being reconciled.
Right. The one with the power and perpetrating the
Yes.
harm needs to be reconciled. Yeah.
Yeah. And then our gospel reading for this episode is from Luke chapter 15, verses 1 through 3 and 11b through 32. Jesus tells the parable of the prodigal son, a story of unearned love and forgiveness despite insult.
So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of resentment. I notice resentment both in the younger son when he is without food, without anything, and working with pigs, and just like resents
Sure.
the pigs for the food, but then also resentment from the older child when the younger child returns and is welcomed with open arms. And I think that the show Dear White People actually does a really good job of giving examples of the ways that resentment can motivate action, because resentment can, as with the younger child, move us to make changes
Sure.
and to work to repair harm, or it can move us towards cruelty or bitterness or isolation, which is what happens with the older brother. And there are other things too, but I think in Dear White
Yeah.
People, there's, right, like when the main character is upset and feels resentment, she starts, like, she has this show that she does called Dear White
Yeah.
People, where she talks about it in the hopes that there is change that can happen when the problems are aired out, when the dirty laundry is
Yeah.
aired out.
As we move into the verses, in verse 2, we read, "And the religious leaders and the scribes were grumbling and saying, 'This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" Oh, look, it's the church's job description. As Emily told that lovely story of the elephants, I will tell this story, which I originally heard as a story in a sermon, and it might have happened at some point, but I think it's a good illustration anyway. Of an electrician who was helping to build or refurbish a school. And when it came time to deciding how to wire the classrooms, the school board expected the electrician to meet with them and they would give the electrician their instructions. But instead, the electrician refused absolutely to talk to the school board and immediately left that room and went and found the teachers who would be teaching in those classrooms and asked them about how those rooms needed to be wired. And therefore, keeping in mind that this story was presumably set before, Chromebooks were endemic everywhere. Thus, every room had 4 outlets on the front wall of the classroom, front being a word in quotes, but like the wall that the kids would be looking at, instead of just the one outlet on the center of each wall, which frankly is exactly how I think all the classrooms I grew up in were wired.
Yep.
That is essentially useless and not helpful. And that the board absolutely would have tried to suggest to the electrician had the electrician met with them instead of the teachers. But because this electrician talked to the teachers at the school instead of talking to the board, the teachers were happy once the place was actually built properly and finished. You spend your time and you help those who need you, right?
Yeah.
You spend your time with the people who need you. You help those who actually need help. And this is why Jesus welcomed sinners and ate with them.
Yeah.
Because they were people, and because you have to have the relationship, and because
And it's not just those who need you, but those who will most benefit from your work, or be most, not even most
yeah,
benefit, but those who are most impacted from what you do.
yes,
Right?
yes, exactly. That's the
Which raises the question, right, that we were talking about at the beginning, of when we think about who is most impacted and how we think about, I think we actually talked about this in our last episode, but how we think about profit in terms of business. But
that's PROFIT, not PROPHET.
correct. But
Given the topic of our show, I think we should be specific.
Yeah. But are we spending time with the more than human creation when they will be the most impacted by decisions that we as humans make about transportation or those sorts of things? And are we spending time with the humans who are most impacted by those decisions, and not just the humans with the most amount of money to influence those decisions?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then in verse 13, we read, and then in verse 13, Jesus, in telling this parable, says, "A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living." So after having asked for all of the things, the son has to leave. And it is fascinating to look at this story from from different perspectives. And I think I have a lot of compassion on the younger child, which is not surprising because I am in fact a younger child. And I've been pretty harsh on the younger child about typically I'm pretty harsh on the younger child in terms of gathering all that they have and traveling to a distant country. Like, do you really need to take all of your money and basically like tell your dad that he's as good as dead to you?
Yeah, the younger son is definitely a brat. Yeah.
And also, when I was 18, I knew that I needed to leave Colorado. I needed to leave
Yeah.
my family of origin because I didn't appreciate the mountains of Colorado as much. And I needed like to go to college because that was what I needed to do.
Sure.
And so I have like a lot more sympathy, and I think about like Anakin Skywalker or even Luke Skywalker, and both of them left those who had raised them, and they had to leave. They had to go and do their best in the world and figure out what was going on in the world. Sometimes it has to happen. And for both of them, like the result for the family that they left behind was really bad. Thankfully, for the prodigal son, that was not the case. But
well, I don't think Luke's leaving was why the terrible things happened to his family.
I'm not saying that that's why
yeah.
the things happen, but sometimes that also happens.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Because Anakin leaving isn't why his mom died, but it happened when he left, after he left.
Yeah.
Sometimes people have to leave, and sometimes they come back.
Yeah. Yeah. And now for our newest segment, Let's Make a Muppet Musical. And Nikira, as our guest, we would love to ask you, of the readings that we discussed today, did you have a thought about where we could put some Muppets, or whether there's a character we can cast as a human?
I really need to see the produce that the Israelites are feasting on for their Passover cast by the singing vegetables in the Muppets and being prepared by the Swedish chef.
Oh, yes. I love that.
Shabbat shalom.
And if I remember correctly, at least some of them would be trying to escape from the Swedish chef as well, which
absolutely
definitely
is half the fun.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. I love that one. Mm-hmm. And of course, Camilla, who we've talked about a little bit, just like hanging out, like watching the produce be consumed because she's a chicken, she's a hen, she's not a lamb, and she's not a vegetable.
She is slowly becoming the mascot of this part of the podcast, though. She has shown up in almost all of our conversations.
So far, yes. Yeah, I love it. Thank you for being with us, Nikira. I'm curious, before you go, are there any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
42!
Yay!
It's really lovely being with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scriptural readings for the 5th Sunday of Lent. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, or if you just want to support us, you can check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch.
Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets Musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.